the insistence upon trouble and suffering as an intrinsic element of human experience. So you could say we could concentrate on subjective experience. What's your life like to you? How do you experience it? And we could say, well, built into that is trouble. Built into that is chaos. Built into that is anxiety and pain and disease, and that you can fall prey to those things without there being something wrong with you. Now, you know, if you pin down a psychoanalyst like Jung or Freud, they would of course admit that human misery is endemic to human experience, but Freud in particular tended to look for adult psychopathology in childhood misadventure, in pathological childhood experience. And he at least implicitly claimed that if you hadn't experienced childhood trauma and you had developed properly, that what would happen is that you would end up healthy, roughly speaking, certainly mentally sound. But the existentialists, they don't really buy that perspective right from the beginning. They basically make a different claim, which is that life is so full of intrinsic misery, let's say, but suffering is a better way of thinking about it. Suffering that manifests itself as a consequence of your intrinsic vulnerability. That psychopathology is built into the human experience. There's no real way of avoiding it, or at least there's no reason to look for extra causes. That might be a better way of thinking about it. And you'd be surprised how often that sort of observation is useful for clinical clients, for example, because one of the things that's quite characteristic about people, especially if they're introverted and they don't have very many friends, they don't have people to talk to, if they're suffering, maybe they're depressed or anxious, or they have some sets of strange symptoms like agoraphobia or obsessive compulsive disorder, one of the things they always presume that is that the fact that they're suffering in that manner means that there's something, not only something wrong with them, but something uniquely wrong with them, so that it's their fault and no one else is like them. And one of the things you do as a diagnostician, you know, you'll hear a lot of rattling about how labeling is bad for people, and certainly mislabeling is bad for people, and even an accurate label can be a box that you can't get out of. But it's very, very frequently the case that if you diagnose someone, it's a relief to them like you can't believe, because they come in to see you knowing that something isn't going properly, but they think, well, they're the only person facing it, and that means they're idiosyncratically strange in some incomprehensible way that no one else could possibly understand, and there's no way they could ever get better. And one of the things you do is point out to them is like, yeah, depression and anxiety doesn't really require any explanation, right? There's plenty of reason. I don't remember who said it. Everyone has sufficient justification for suicide. I think that was the claim. Well, but the point is that if you look through the experiences of the typical person, unless they're very, very fortunate, and they won't be that way forever, that's certainly the case, that they can point to traumatic experiences in their life, death and loss and illness and humiliation and all those sorts of things, that are sufficient to account for existence in a state of quasi-permanent negative emotion. Now, often if you see, as I said, if you see people who are depressed and anxious by nature, they assume that everyone else is the smiling face that you see on Facebook, and so that alienates them from other people and themselves even more than certainly far more than necessary. And part of the psychoeducation that goes along with therapy is merely educating people to understand that a fair bit of misery is the norm, and that there's plenty of genuine reason for it. And so the existentialists basically start from that stance. I mean, people think they don't believe that, but they believe it all the time. And it's frequently how people experience themselves, you know, as if there's something wrong that needs to be rectified. And it seems unique in some sense to human beings. It doesn't seem all that obvious that animals think that way, but people definitely think that way. And so, well, the existentialists basically take that as a given. And then they offer another question, which is, well, given that that's your lot and that there's ample reason for misery, how is it that you should conduct yourself? Because merely, say, giving into that misery or multiplying it
When you have a mental health issue, part of your wiring is insufficient to help you process day-to-day life. That's it. And there are certain chemicals that are helping you. There are certain therapies that will help you. So here's the deal. The way I feel about it is this. This is not something to ignore. If you have depression, if you have anxiety, if you have post-traumatic stress disorder, if you have any kind of mental health condition, it's nothing to be ashamed of, and it's nothing to hide, and it's something to hit head on with. There's one thing that if you did every single day, no joke, it would make an extraordinary difference in whatever mental health issue you're struggling with, and that is exercise. And the reason why I say this is not based on my own personal experience. It's based on the fact that I think it's the American Psychiatric Association. This is coming from Dr. John Rady, a friend of mine who has written a ton of books about not only ADHD, but also the benefits of exercise and what it has on your brain. But he's also a professor at Harvard and a practicing clinician. And this is his area of expertise. And one of the things that they now mandate as a diagnosis for anybody with depression or anxiety, or any mental illness, frankly, is you've got to exercise every day. And the reason you've got to exercise every day is because what we know about human beings is that when you physically move, your physiology changes, and that changes your brain. Getting your heart rate up, getting outside, breathing, feeling connected, getting out of your house, which may make you feel depressed and trapped. Doing that every day, that physical push. You don't have to run. You don't have to go to an aerobics class. Get outside with your dog in the woods. Walk with a good friend for 2 or 3 miles. Doing that every single day not only moves your body, which changes your mind, it gets you out of your physical environment, which is one of the things that people with depression tend to have a hard time doing. And it also creates a bit of momentum and a bit of a routine in your life. You take on just that single thing. Get outside and exercise every single day as if your life depends upon it. Because you know what? It does. Your brain needs it. Your body needs it. Your mental health needs it. So, in closing, be open. Don't be ashamed. Get the help that you need. If you want to start doing something today that you can manage every single day, you can't go wrong with forcing yourself to exercise. And by the way, what can you use to get your butt out the door? You guessed it, the 5-second rule. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Give yourself a push, and you're going to feel a lot better.
Because merely, say, giving into that misery or multiplying it doesn't seem to be do anything but multiply it. It doesn't seem to do anything but increase it. Now, so if it's bad to begin with, you might say, well, increasing it is something that you have to regard as worse. So how do you conduct yourself in the face of misery? Okay, so how do they present that to begin with? Well, this is from Pascal. And this is an existential statement that describes the position of the individual in the universe, you might say, or you could say that it explains a deep characteristic of individual experience or existence, hence existentialism. When I consider the brief span of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and behind it, the small space that I fill or even see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces which I know not, and which know not me, I am afraid, and wonder to see myself here rather than there. For there's no reason why I should be here rather than there, or now rather than then. And so that's an element of existential thinking that is shared with the phenomenologists called thrownness. That's a term that Heidegger originated, if I remember correctly. And what it means is it's an analysis of a certain characteristic of human experience, which is that, well, there was an immense span of time in which you could have been born, but you weren't born then, you were born 20 years ago. And there was an immense span of time in the future that you could have been born, and you weren't born then either. You were born when you were born, and you're who you are, and you have exactly the characteristics that you have. And there's something tremendously arbitrary about that. It's as if you were thrown into experience, and that's what thrownness means. It means that you were randomly placed in a place and time, and there's something fundamentally irrational about that, meaning that there's no real way of understanding it. It's something you have to deal with. And you might say, well, why was I born poor? Or why was I born less attractive than I might be? Or why was I born less intelligent than I might be? Or maybe why was I born to these terrible parents at this particular horrible moment in time? And in some sense, there's no answer to questions like that. It's just how it is.
There's a couple different types of stress. Now, if it's something that you can control that's causing you stress, well, why aren't you getting control of it? Generally, it's a lack of discipline. So you gotta have the discipline to grab control and make it happen. And when I say you need discipline for that, what that means is these stresses that you're avoiding, they're not gonna go away if you avoid them. So take the discipline to face the stressful situation. Get ahead of it. Don't be afraid of it. Now, there's also stress that's caused by things that you cannot control. And if you remember talking earlier about artillery and how horrible that was, and what made it so horrible was that there's no control over it. So if you can't control something, and you can't get control of it, you have to at least embrace what you can. And I'm not saying you're going to embrace artillery shelling, but I'll tell you what, when it comes to things like artillery, or for us in Ramadi, it was IEDs. And we could do everything we could do to mitigate that risk, but eventually there's only so much you can do, and you cannot completely eliminate it. But you can't control it, so why are you going to worry about it? Why are you going to stress about it? If there's something that's completely beyond your control, you've got to detach from it and not let yourself get stressed about it. And on top of that, if it's something that you can't control, how can you look at it in a different light? How can you see it in a way that you could actually take advantage of it? How can you take that stress and make it into some kind of ally? You know, the chaos of combat is something that I couldn't control, but I had to embrace it so I could try and figure out how to take advantage of it. So when it comes to stress, don't fight it. Turn it on itself and use it. Use it. Use it to make yourself sharper and more alert. And use it to make yourself think more and learn more and get better. And use that stress as a catalyst to make yourself better.
I think you can certainly make a case, like the existentialists do, that the mere fact that you're limited in the face of infinite complexity is also a primary existential problem. It's a problem that human beings have been dealing with ever since they started to understand. They started to make sense of concepts that were beyond their immediate experience. You know, millions of years ago, or tens of millions of years ago, when our ancestors lived in trees, you could be sure that they were frightened of what surrounded them. They were frightened of, when they were little, they were frightened of birds that might pick them out of a tree, or they were afraid of cats that might climb a tree and eat them. They were afraid of snakes that would come slithering along and bite them. And they existed in a space that was safe, surrounded by a space that wasn't safe, that was full of predatory entities. And those were primarily birds of prey and cats and snakes or other reptiles. And then what seemed to have happened as we evolved was that the way we construed the world, you can think of the world as a safe place surrounded by the possibility of predation, but you can also think of the world as the known surrounded by the unknown. It's the same idea, except put up one level of abstraction. And so we have this very paradoxical wiring, you might say. The unknown is partly terror, and that's the prepotent element of the unknown. So negative emotion for human beings is more powerful than positive emotion is, sort of dose for dose. And I think that's because you can be completely and utterly dead, but you can only be so much happier. And so it makes much more sense to be tilted to some degree towards sensitivity to negative emotion than it does to be tilted towards sensitivity for positive emotion. But it's also another one of those things that makes life rather intrinsically difficult, because negative emotions are commonplace and they're powerful, and they need to be, because otherwise you'd wander stupidly into something that would kill you. And it's better to be anxious than to be in pain or dead, even though it's not so good to be anxious.